When it comes to home prices, down about 5%. And I think the price declines are going to continue through 2026. So as a buyer, you're going to have a lot more choice. 348 active listings to start the year. That is easily the fewest number of new listings I have on record. Worst year in like 20, 30 years. Less than 24,000 homes sold in Vancouver through the course of the year. So absolutely terrible year for sales. Hey there, and welcome back to Prairie Real Estate. My name is Matthew Pfeiffer. I'm a real estate agent in Regina, Saskatchewan, and that is my trusted assistant, Matilda. This is my monthly Canadian real estate market update for January 2026. We're going individual cities, Victoria, all the way out to Halifax, breaking down all the data, diving into the stats, so you know what's going on. We're not just looking at the national stats. You're gonna know exactly what's going on in your particular city. But of course, we start this off with another one of my terrible bad dad jokes. Why are skeletons so calm? Because they never let anything get under their skin. If you have a terrible joke I can use a future episode, put it in the comments below. Let's get you up to speed on the Canadian real estate market. In Victoria, a couple things to note. Sales were higher in 2025 than 2024, 2023, 2022. So we actually saw a bump in sales over the last couple of years. And unlike in Vancouver, where sales are at 20-year lows, that's not what we're seeing in Victoria. And when you look at new listings, this is interesting. Consistently 12,000 new listings in Victoria for basically every single year up until the last two, 14,500 in 2024 and over 15,000 in 2025. And as a buyer, I think you're going to be happy about the Victoria real estate market in 2026, specifically when it comes to selection. There's a lot of inventory in the market right now, and I think that's going to be continuing all through 2026. So as a buyer, you're going to have a lot more choice. It also means you will probably have more leverage in negotiations over sellers as well. And speaking of that, when it comes to market balance, both the months of inventory and sales to active listing ratio are heavily favoring buyers right now. It's only sales new listing ratio that favors sellers. When it comes to home prices in Victoria, essentially no change year over year. Unlike in Vancouver, where we're seeing some fairly significant price drops. And some of that might be the government and retirement influence in the Victoria real estate market. I think the big question for 2026 and the Victoria real estate market is, do we see price decreases year over year? If I'm betting, I think we will at some point. I just don't know how many months and how much it's going to drop. Okay, let's talk about Regina. That, of course, is my market. And if you are thinking about moving to Regina, buying a house, please give me a call. You can actually look in the description of this video where you can book me in for a buyer's consultation. Let's grab a coffee, go chat about it at some point. And don't worry, if you're somewhere else in Canada, I can still get you set up with a fantastic real estate agent. Again, link in the description below where you can book me in for a buyer's consultation. I'll learn about what's important to you and then get you set up with the perfect agent. Let's dive back into Regina stats. Somebody just sent me a funny joke. I'll have to use it in a future video. My eyes itchy. Now, in December, I think a lot of people would describe it as a somewhat slower month in Regina. And I have a good reason as to why that is. It's the weather. It was outrageously cold, and especially the back half of December, that definitely slowed things down. My phone wasn't ringing nearly as much. Now, it's sluggish in comparison to the last couple of years, which were rip-roaring busy. You know, having, 165 homes a month, that's still a very busy December for Regina. Similar story when it comes to new listings. Only 140 homes put up for sale. Just kind of going through the stats, and actually over the stats I have, go back to 2018, there hasn't been a month of December, at least, where we had fewer listings than what we did this year. So sellers weren't interested in playing the cold weather either. And with 3,855 homes sold in the year, that is second all time for home sales in a year in Regina, second only to 2024. And of course, in 2024, there was typically 10 to 15% more inventory available. So essentially that lack of inventory is probably the only reason we didn't see a new sales record set. Unfortunately for home buyers going into 2026, this is what's got me nervous. 348 active listings to start the year. That is easily the fewest number of new listings I have on record. I'm gonna have to dig back to the records and see if there's been a year in even the last 20 years with fewer active listings to start a year than what we're starting this year with. And if we don't see more new listings come to the market, I think the spring market in Regina is going to be another very busy one with a lot of bidding wars amongst buyers. When it comes to the market balance indicators, months of inventory, sales to new listing ratio, and sales to active listing ratio, all heavily leaning towards sellers right now. So if you're trying to sell a house in Regina right now and it's not selling, pricing is your problem almost for sure. Talking about home prices, up almost 6% in Regina year over year. That's a substantial increase in Regina. We typically don't see price increases that much in the city. And actually, November to December, we saw a price increase of about $1,600. That usually doesn't happen either. Saskatoon ended the year with a bang, 270 homes sold, and they had a lot of similar cold weather that we had in Regina, although maybe not quite as extreme. That might have been part of it. Missed setting a record by only 4 sales. Back in 2020, they sold 274 homes in the same month. And they also ended the year with 5,100 sales in the year. That is the second most on record in Saskatoon. A little bit of good news for home buyers in Saskatoon is that there was a decent number of new listings pretty much throughout the year. Looking versus the 5-year average, we do have months where it's below, but for the most part, new listings were above the 5-year average through most of 2025. And maybe another tiny little sliver of good news for home buyers in Saskatoon, 436 homes for sale to start the year. Yep, that's only slightly better than last year, but it is better, I guess, so maybe an improvement. We'll have to wait and see. Either way, it's not a lot of inventory, and if we don't see a ton of inventory come to the market, I think we're going to see a return to bidding wars back in Saskatoon very soon. When you look at the market balance indicators, sales to active listing ratio, sales to new listing ratio, and months of inventory all are screaming strong sellers markets right now. Looking at prices, Saskatoon is still very affordable compared to most other cities in Canada, but we've seen a 6% year over year increase this year. And I just went and kind of looked things back. We've seen about $100,000 increase since 2020 in Saskatoon. Looking at the Halifax Real Estate Market, with just under 5,000 homes sold in the year, that means we've seen now 3 years in a row the home sales have actually increased in Halifax. Of course, nowhere near, look at 2022, over 5,000, but 2021, over 8,000 homes sold that year. It was bonkers in Halifax then. But even still, rewind this 2020, 2019, and I could go back even further. The Halifax real estate market was really busy long before pandemic, long before ultra low interest rates, everything. It's been bonkers in Halifax for the better part of a decade now. At least though, there was more new listings coming to market this year in Halifax. That's part of what's balanced it out a little bit. You can see it when we get to prices here. So with about 6,800 new listings throughout the year, that's better than what it's been since 2022 here. Of course, a lot more new listings coming to the market. Previous to that, it's been really sluggish the last few years. Now, this is really interesting. Looking at active listings in Halifax, and every time I've gone through these charts, it still kind of amazes me. So right now, 862 homes for sale in the Halifax area. Look at 2022. They started with 170 homes for sale in the year. I remember talking to agents in this time frame going like, what do I do? There's like one house available for my buyers and 10, 15, 20 buyers are making offers. It's going for like $100,000 over asking price. Like, how do you provide any sort of advice to your buyers at that point when there's just nothing to buy? And a little more good news for buyers is that with months inventory at 3.1, that's the highest it's been to start a year in quite a while. How about home prices? Of course, we've seen massive increases in home prices in Halifax, and this year, still some pretty sizable increases. Average price was up over 5%. And I just want to, go back here. You look at 2021, we've seen over $100,000 increase since 2021. That's sizable when your average price is only $600,000 today. And I do think we will continue to see home prices rise in Halifax in 2026, although I think it's going to be less of an increase than we saw in 2025. Now, Edmonton is a really interesting market to take a look at because a lot of people are expecting it to take off like Calgary did. And we did see a big increase, nowhere near what happened in Calgary. And some of that is to do with the fact that Edmonton's a government town. You'll see this in other cities that are government towns. They don't go up as fast. They also don't go down as fast typically. We'll have to see if that plays out. I do think we're going to see price declines in Edmonton in 2026 though. When it comes to home sales in Edmonton, they're down versus last year. But that's really not a fair comparison. 2024 in Edmonton was by far the busiest real estate market they've ever had. Just look at the numbers here. Almost 29,000 homes sold in 2024. The next best year was 2021 at almost 25,000 here. So 2025, almost 27,000 home sales. That's still an exceptionally busy year in Edmonton. Also, 1 month never makes a trend, but we had seen 3 months in a row where the sales versus the 5-year had actually been shrinking. And then this past month, we saw it increase again. But what we did see in Edmonton is a big jump in new listings, over 40,000 new listings in the year. And now, according to my records, and I only have the last 10 years, there's never been a year with 40,000 new listings up until 2025. When it comes to active inventory, this is kind of similar to what we're seeing in Calgary. You can look at the data from 2021 going forward, or you can look at it 2020 kind of going backward. And there's a big dividing line there. So right now, about 4,500 active listings, essentially the same as the 5-year average. But look, 2020 and earlier, 6,000, 7,000 active listings those years. 2018 was down a little bit, but for the most part, you see big numbers in active listings well above what you have right now in Edmonton. Looking at the market balance indicators, months of inventory is a balanced market, but just barely. Sales to active listing ratio is in seller's market territory, and sales to new listing ratio is also in seller's market territory. Now, when it comes to home prices, there's something I just noticed in the last 3 years I thought was really interesting. All 3 years, 2023, 2024, and now 2025, we saw a very minuscule, literally hundreds of dollars increase month over month in home prices. You look at essentially any other previous year, and prices are typically declining month over month. October, November, December, that's generally when you see prices slide. So just unusual that you see that increase the last 3 years in a row. And in 2025, it's the first time since 2022 that prices are lower at the end of the year than they were at the beginning of the year. Calgary was once the boom town when it came to home prices. And now, well, things are drying up faster than the water supply. Is it too soon to make that joke? Sorry. When it comes to home sales in Calgary, there's a massive dividing line. Pre-2021 and post-2021. So we had about 23,000 homes sold in Calgary in 2025, and that's terrible versus the last couple of years. Compare it to anything earlier than 2021, and it's a massive monster record-setting year for home sales. And when it comes to new listings, we're actually kind of getting back to what would be considered normal, with 1,200 new listings last month. So that's only up 3% from the 5-year average, and really not out of line over the 10-year average either. And when it comes to active inventory, this I think is interesting. Versus last year in the 5-year average, way more inventory. And that's also really misleading. Much like sales, kind of pre-2021 and post-2021, very different numbers. You look here, 2020, over 5,000 active listings this time of year, and it gets bigger as you go back. So again, there's that real big differentiation between what's happened in, say, the last 5 years and anything prior to that. When it comes to the market balance indicators, here's kind of what I think is interesting. Months of inventory, barely a balanced market. Sales to new listing ratio, strong seller's market. Sales to active listing ratio, right on the edge between balanced and sellers. Again, sometimes these metrics taken in isolation are misleading. Look at the trends, that's more important. When it comes to home prices, down about 5% in Calgary year over year right now. And I think the price declines are going to continue through 2026. That was what I had in my predictions video. You should watch that if you haven't already. So Toronto had the largest price decreases, with Calgary and Vancouver basically kind of neck and neck for overall price declines. Of course, 5% on $1 million plus in Vancouver is a whole lot more than 5% on $500,000 or $600,000 in Calgary in terms of dollar amount. Looking at prices here, $550,000. So that kind of sets things back below 2023 levels, but higher than 2022 prices. Turning our attention now to the Winnipeg Real Estate Market. And I want to remind all my Winnipeg Blue Bomber fans out there that the Saskatchewan Roughriders are your defending Grey Cup champions. Just thought I'd throw that in there for the first time in 2026. Let's talk about the market. It was a very busy one in 2025. I've got some thoughts. I'm going to talk about what I think is going to happen in 2026, but let's dive into the stats here. So the year, 15,000 homes sold. That is the third busiest all time in Winnipeg's history, and a really solid month, although it was down a little bit from the 5-year average. Now, remember, with that 5-year sales average, we still have the 2020 and 2021 numbers for this last month, and those really skew the data. Once those start falling off, you're going to see that 2025 was really busy in comparison to basically any other year, not those. What I find really interesting when it comes to new listings is just how consistent Winnipeg has been through the course of essentially the last decade here. You can look, 22,000 new listings. You pick the year, and that's about what they get, whether the market is really doing well or even in times when it's been a little bit softer, that's essentially what you're going to get. So it's a little surprising. I haven't seen really any variation on that at all. And what I thought was interesting about this month, 804 new listings in December, exactly the same as December 2024, and the 5-year average is 802. Now, for our first data point in 2026, let's take a look at active inventory. With about 2,300 active listings, that's the lowest active inventory since 2022, meaning buyers in Winnipeg are going to start the year with the least choice they've had. And I think if this continues, it's going to be a very challenging spring market for buyers in Winnipeg. Looking at the market balance metrics, all of them are either at a seller's market or right on the edge. Months of inventory is the only one that's on the edge right now between a seller's and a balance market. Sales to new listing ratio, that's well into a seller's market, and sales to active listing ratio tipped into a seller's market as well. And the bad news for buyers is that all of these metrics are showing a stronger seller's market going into the year than what we saw going into 2025. Talking about prices, you can see that the benchmark price has dropped about $13,000 since it peaked out here. June, it peaked at about $390,000. We're just under $380,000 now. That's pretty typical for Winnipeg. Weather cools off, so does the pricing. I think as we get into 2026, we're going to see a repeat of what we generally see in Winnipeg. Spring market, probably going to see prices start to increase again as well. I think the really big question going into 2026 is going to be, will we see that composite benchmark break $400,000? I think that's fairly likely this year. And year over year, prices are up about 5% in Winnipeg, meaning Winnipeg sees some of the largest price increases in Canada this year. Looking into the Toronto real estate market, let's start off with sales, and they are abysmal. And that's being nice. With about 62,000 sales in the year, that is half of what the sales were in 2021, which was of course their record year. And from what I understand, going back through the data, it's the worst year in sales in 20 years. Absolutely terribly sluggish market. And we're also seeing a massive fall off in the number of agents registered in the Toronto Real Estate Board. And I am all for that. For years, there's been way too many real estate agents in Toronto, many of them part-time. In fact, I believe that half of the agents in Toronto that are registered won't even sell a house in a year on average. And I think it's only like 1 or 2% of agents in Toronto even sell a house a month. And that's why I say there's no substitution for experience. I don't care how long you've been in the business. Are you actually consistently selling houses day in and day out? Because if you're not, you don't have a good understanding of the market. And that is what you need as a buyer, an agent that has that experience and knowledge of the market. If you're looking at buying a house, you don't have a great agent, I'd love to set you up with one of my hand-picked high-performing agents that knows the market really, really well. If you look in the description of this video, you can see a link to my calendar where you can book me in for a buyer's consultation, and I'll get you set up with that awesome agent. Let's get back to the video talking about new listings. Going into 2025, and you're going to hear it again in 2026, all the stories about the dreaded mortgage renewal wave that's going to flood the real estate market. And you already know what I'm going to say about this, a lot more hype than reality. Now, in 2025, there's about 185,000 properties that put up for sale. That includes all the ones that were canceled and relisted that failed to sell. And is that the most new listings? Well, at least according to the records I've got, I actually think it is. 2017, though, came very close. 183,000 new listings in the same time frame. But is it a wave of new listings? I'll let you guys fight over that in the comments. And what I do think is really interesting here is comparing to the 5-year average. You can see April, May, June, July, and September, October to some degree, huge increases over the 5-year average. And then we get into here December, we're still up 10%. That's substantial, but at least it looks like it's trending down a little bit. You know, early in the year, May, 36% up, and now we're up 10. And if you look at just the total numbers of new listings, you know, 5,300, we're 1 the clock, 52, 38, 4,000, 5,100, 5,800, 3,500, 4,300, 6,300. So the 5,200 isn't that out of line over, say, the last decade. The fun piece of trivia you can use on all your friends is, what year did the Toronto real estate market set a record every single month for the most active listings? Correct answer is 2025. Yes, We now have seen 12 consecutive months every month in 2025 where the active inventory for that particular month was an all-time record high. Of course, everybody's been talking about how much negotiation power and leverage buyers have. Looking at the metrics, overall, it's maybe a little bit less than what people are feeling that buyers have, although I do agree 100% buyers, you absolutely in the driver's seat in this market right now. Look at months of inventory. It's only 3.4 months of inventory. Sales new listing ratio at 70, which actually puts it in a seller's market. And the sales to active listing ratio at 22, almost just barely shy of 22, is the second highest it was all of 2025. And that is still technically a seller's market as well. I've seen the argument made that, you know what, these metrics are not really representative of the market today. And maybe that is true. I'm just not sure what other metric we would use to determine, you know, what the market favors and what generally can result in prices going up or going down. If you have a better solution, let me know in the comments below. And home prices in Toronto continue to drop. They're down 6% year over year. I talked about this in my short about the Toronto real estate market. If you guys loving those, let me know in the comments below. But home prices, dollar value dropped about $60,000. That, of course, is more than a lot of individuals make an entire year in Toronto. And I posed this question a few videos ago. Will we see this composite benchmark price drop below $900,000, meaning we'll see an 8 in front of this number at some point in 2026? I think that's a possibility. I talked about it in my predictions video. I could see it being very likely the Toronto real estate market sees another year. We see 3, 5, 6% drops in prices. And if that happens, that's about where we'd end the year, 890-ish somewhere. That would be really interesting to see how close this little hot take prediction I just made ends up becoming. Looking at the Montreal real estate market, and a lot of this also applies to Quebec City, there's some interesting things that I've heard when I'm talking to agents there. And when I looked at the stats, I noticed we've kind of seen a little bit of a softening, not only in sales, but also new listings. And I was asking a friend there, what are you seeing? And they brought up a point that I hadn't thought about, and that is Quebec has a provincial election coming up here in 2026. And as of right now, the polls are indicating the PQ looks like they're going to win that election. And of course, the PQ would likely want to push for a separation referendum. And that's never good for the real estate market because it creates fear and uncertainty, probably the two things real estate markets hate the most. People aren't running out to buy houses and spend $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 when potentially they're in a different country coming up. So that's going to, I think, overshadow the real estate market all through 2026. If all this happens. A lot of ifs there. Now, with over 47,000 sales in the year, 2025 ends the year easily the busiest real estate market Montreal's seen since 2021. There's almost 55,000 sales then. And as you can see, it's been a trend up every year. 22, 23, 24, all seeing more sales than the previous year. Now, with all the uncertainty the election is likely going to bring, I have a feeling in 2026, we will see fewer sales than we saw in 2025. The one good news for home buyers in Montreal in 2025 was the fact there was a ton of new listings that hit the market. And as you can see, just if I go through kind of recent history, up until 2016, you don't see more than 70,000 new listings in the year, and we had almost 74,000 this year in Montreal. So that is also partially why they had more sales, because there was just more for buyers to choose from, but clearly more stuff coming to the market than any time recently. There's a little more good news for home buyers in Montreal, and that is active inventory is up significantly from what it's been recently. If you wind the clock back more, you'll see Montreal typically has more inventory on the market. Well over 20,000 is not abnormal for Montreal. When it comes to the market balance stats, it's a little all over the place. Months of inventory at 5.5 says it's leaning towards a buyer's market, although still in balanced market territory. The sales to listing ratio is leaning more towards a seller's market, and the sales to active listing ratio is in a balanced market in Montreal. And looking at home prices, Montreal is going to get overshadowed by Quebec City for the highest year-over-year price increases in all of Canada. Quebec City's gone absolutely bonkers the last couple of years. Even still, a 5% increase in Montreal, that's nothing to sneeze at. I do think prices in 2026 in Montreal will continue to rise, although I think it's going to be more that, 2, 3, 4% kind of range. I talked about this in my predictions video. If you haven't watched that, you should check it out. I'll link that in the description below. Ottawa is the real estate market where it seems to defy gravity. And there is some explanation to that. You guessed it, the government influence is absolutely a major factor in the real estate market there. And there's been a lot of talk about how much the federal government cutting back in jobs is going to impact the Ottawa real estate market. I've said it, I'll continue to say it, that it's going to matter not only how many jobs are cut. There were some wild numbers thrown out before the budget. From what I've seen, the government's planning to cut about 30,000 jobs across the entire country. It may be more concentrated in Ottawa. And if that were to happen, obviously, that would be a significant impact on the Ottawa real estate market. When I'm talking to not only agents in Ottawa, but people in Ottawa, and some of your viewers have been fantastic, providing me some information. Most of these job cuts are more early retirements and natural attrition, not as many people actually getting laid off. Now, if you look at the year, 13,500 sales means they just edge out last year's 13,488. And then you look here, 2021, you almost 18,000, 2020, 16,000, 16,000, 15,000 as you rewind. So no doubt about it, a significantly slower 2025 than recent history. And my prediction for 2026, I didn't put it in my predictions video, we'll see less than 13,000 houses sell in Ottawa in 2026. That'll be interesting to watch. So in 2025, in terms of new listings, over 26,000 new listings for the year. Looking at the data here, you can see just in terms of recent history, nothing even close to that. And even if I dig back further, I'm pretty sure we're not going to find a year with more than 26,000 homes put up for sale in Ottawa. So record year for Ottawa for that. Looking at active inventory, we have our last data point for 2025, 2,500 active listings. Now, when we revisit this next month, we're going to have a different baseline because 2020 is going to fall off. And that is basically when listings or active listings were at all-time lows. It's going to make the comparison versus the 5-year average artificially, I guess you call it, look better than it actually is. So we're going to monitor the trends more than the pure numbers. Now, somewhat similar to what we see in Toronto, the market balance metrics don't necessarily match what people are seeing on the ground day to day because months of inventory, sales to new listing ratio, and sales to active listing ratio all indicate a seller's market in Ottawa, not a balanced or a buyer's market, as probably most buyers are more seeing on the regular basis there. Looking at home prices in Ottawa, every single month was a year-over-year increase. Obviously, very different than what they saw in Toronto in 2025. I still think in 2026, we're going to see year-over-year price declines and an overall softening of the market, but I don't think it's going to be as severe as what they're going to see in Toronto. Second busiest year on record. That is how you describe the Quebec City real estate market in a sentence. 10,300 sales in the year. Only 2020 had more sales with 10,600. And back in 2020, there was 4 to 5 times more homes for sale than there was in 2025. Had there been anywhere close to that level of inventory, I suspect that 2025 would have easily seen the most sales on record. They're also not really getting much for new listings. In fact, the last couple of months, it's been going the wrong direction with even fewer new listings hitting the market. So for the year, under 12,000, which in a bubble looks okay. It's actually better than the last few years, but nowhere in comparison. You'll look at 2019, 2018, 2017, when you've got significantly more new listings that hit the market. The only good news for buyers, I guess, when looking at active inventory is it's better than it was last year. And that's not saying much because, of course, last year, basically lowest level of inventory on record, and we're just slightly higher than that now. So it's going to be a tough spring for buyers if we see these low levels of inventory as we head into that spring market in 2026. And when it comes to the market balance indicators, I'm going to update these charts here, and I got to get you sales to new listing ratio and sales to active listing ratio. So I got to put a reminder on my phone or something to update that. Maybe get my editor to put a note on my calendar or something. We'll figure it out. But months of inventory at 1.5 means it's a strong seller's market. And this is going to make you cry or laugh. I guess it depends how you view it. With a 12% year-over-year increase in December, that's the smallest increase Quebec City saw in all of 2025. In May, prices were up nearly 20% year-over-year. I've said it before, I'll say it again. This is unsustainable and it will not continue forever. We might see another big year in 2026, and it might be 8, 9, 10% increase year over year. But this is going to come to an end at some point. I just don't know when. So make your buying decisions appropriately. If you're anticipating prices to go up 10, 20% year over year, you're going to get caught eventually, and it's not going to be a good result for you. Worst year in like 20, 30 years. That's basically how you describe the Vancouver real estate market when it comes to sales. Less than 24,000 homes sold in Vancouver through the course of the year. So absolutely terrible year for sales. Now, as a buyer, that's probably actually something you want to hear, because that's going to force sellers to drop prices more than they already have to get their places sold. Going into 2025, and you're going to hear the same stories going into this year, they said, well, there's going to be all of these renewals coming up and no one's going to be able to afford the mortgages. So they're going to be forced to sell their homes. There's going to be all these new listings. That was that mortgage renewal wave. Spoiler alert, didn't really happen in 2025. I don't think we're going to see a big wave like we're expecting in 2026 as well. Now, there was more new listings, about 64,000 properties put up for sale. That also includes all properties that were relisted as well. And yes, that's above the last few years, but you can see even 2021, there wasn't a mortgage renewal wave then, and there was about 62,000 properties listed for sale in that year. If you are house shopping in Vancouver in 2026, I do think you're going to see a similar trend to what we've seen last year, and there's lots of active inventory. Now, when I talked to agents in Vancouver, one thing I heard all of last year was that, yeah, there might be a lot of total properties in the market. If you look at the numbers, the quality wasn't always great though. Lots of condos sitting around, less homes, and especially those single family homes at more affordable price points for buyers to find. Looking at the market balance metrics, sales to active inventory, months of inventory, both showing that there's a strong buyer's market, while the sales to new listing ratio is actually showing a very strong seller's market. That's skewed by the more limited numbers of both sales and new listings that we saw at the end of the year. And how about a 5% decline in home prices? That is what they saw in Vancouver. Composite benchmark price now $1.1 million. That actually puts us back to essentially 2022 pricing. And I think we're going to continue to see prices slide. Let me know in the comments, how far do prices drop in Vancouver? I think the big shocker would be if we saw prices drop below $1 million. That would be a massive threshold if they end up getting there. Now, if you're enjoying this video, please give this video a like. I would really appreciate it. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you're enjoying this content, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. I think half of you are not subscribed, so I would really appreciate that. That's all I've got for the first time in 2026 on the Canadian real estate market. Thanks very much for watching.